Okay, thanks everybody. We're going to move swiftly on because we're up against the time. We got a distinguished panel that are going to take forward the politics of reparations and Pan-Africanism and the theme of that. And our last panel really set us a few challenges, which I hope they'll respond to, particularly what Jacqueline said at the end about, you know, all these conferences and different meetings and international initiatives happen, but what really happens at the end of all of this? How do we join up the work? How do we do the local, from the local to the global? So these are really important questions. As I said, we have a distinguished panel. Right Honourable Diane Abbott, MP, the Mother of the House. And a beloved and steadfast supporter of racial justice. And I think the applause really reaffirms that. We also have Sister Esther Xosei, who's the Executive Director of Stop the Mountain. And Sister Esther has been on the front lines for over 30 years on this issue. So we appreciate her efforts. And then joining the panel is also the Right Honourable Jeremy Corbyn. And Marcus Ryder, who has jointly published a book. He's a very well-respected and award-winning journalist, but he's just published a book and co-authored a book with Lenny Henry, The Big Payback on How Reparations Can Change the World. And finally, we have Councillor Scott Ainslie, Lambeth Green Party councillor, a long-time supporter of the APPG on African reparations. So I'll invite the speakers up to speak in the order that I introduced them. But first of all, I just wanted to say a few things. That Jacqueline and Robin mentioned a lot of the initiatives that are going on, and also our brother from the Caribbean. But it's important to bring people up to date to some of the other developments, because lots of organizations are working hard. I mean, the APPG itself in the last year produced a policy brief on pushing government to do three things in terms of our ancestral remains that are in the institutions, in the galleries, museums and academies. So we have remains that are there that were taken during colonialism and slavery. There's a very important case of the Zimbabwean, the first Chimaranga heroes who were fighting against West Cecil Rhodes. And 4 of them were basically captured, beheaded, and their skulls were taken to the UK and kept, we think, in the Natural History Museum, although today the Natural History Museum says they don't have them. So we have world-class institutions, apparently, that look after material and artifacts and claim that they're the best places for these artifacts and to be in, but can't look after the 4 heroes of the first liberation struggle in Zimbabwe, whose acre and position in the National Heroes ground has been preserved, awaiting their return. And their distressed families are waiting to be reconnected with their ancestors. So we've published a policy brief through the APPG directed to government to say 3 things, 3 major recommendations. One, that the sale of ancestral remains be banned. You may not be aware that you can't buy ivory in this country, but you can buy human remains. And frequently they come up in auction of so-called primitive peoples sometimes. So we want that banned. Secondly, we want the display of ancestral remains to be banned as well. You go to the British Museum, and on the mummy floor, so-called mummy floor, there were high-ranking African officials who were on display, and kids come in with their parents on a Sunday and take selfies next to this. So we've asked for that to happen. And then the third major request is that all the institutions that hold ancestral remains be regulated and be transparent about what they hold. Again, if you hold in firearms, you would have to, as an institution, you would have to be transparent about that and why the firearm is there, how it's being looked after in terms of it not being deployed for harm. So why can't you do this with human operations? So those are one of the big pieces of work that Bell has led on in the last year. And through the APPG, I think all the activists here involved in different initiatives. But it's important to mention that and to also talk about, as everybody has said, the importance of justice, not just for our ancestors, but for descendants. And a huge affront to descendants is the way ancestral remains are treated. So in this AU year, you know, we have to take some small victories, and we know sometimes these big declarations don't lead very far, but the AU year of reparations, 2025, later on there's work to convert that to a decade of reparations so that we can continue to gather and get the support of CARICOM, the AU, within that framework to convene all the different initiatives that we're doing. So I wanted to tell just a very small story, sorry everybody, but about the limitations of these big organizations like the AU and what they can actually do. I used to run a development organization, and we were always frustrated with the AU not harnessing the African diaspora for development. You send emails, you want a declaration, nothing was happening. And then we attended a conference in Addis, went into the office for the diaspora unit of the AU, and there were 7 people there. Our office in London had more people, and they were looking after a continent, and the diaspora spread around the world. So we understood there that what they were good at doing was passing the declarations, convening people, and then we have to do the work because they don't have the capacity. And to expect them to have the capacity to deliver is, I think, it's us not being realistic. So the work has to be done by us. And Diane and some of the policymakers on the panel will talk to us about this. So without much further ado, I'm going to invite Diane to talk about what is possible in that local space.
Well, you have heard from so many distinguished speakers this morning already, and you're going to hear from some more. But I think this is a tremendously important conference. I want to congratulate all the people who have worked on it. In particular, as you have heard, I want to congratulate Miss Belle Ribeiro-Addy. You cannot imagine how hard she has worked dealing with some of you, and you're all, and you're all very lovely, but some of you aren't necessarily the easiest people to deal with. But she has worked so hard to make this possible, and you cannot say that often enough. Jacqueline mentioned our Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, and she suggested that he wasn't as committed to reparations as he might be. All I can tell you as a Member of Parliament is he's not that committed to socialism, let alone reparations. Let's begin at the beginning. In 1833, the British government paid 165 billion in compensation to slave owners for their loss of property, because for decades this debate around slavery has been about slaves as property, not as people. And what is important about the reparations movement is we are not talking about loss of property. We're talking about people with families, with lives, and we're seeking to look back and go forward in support of people and what they lost. But when we talk about reparations, we're not just talking about money. When you raise reparations with some people, they say, oh, well, why should we pay all this money? This was so long ago. This has nothing to do with us. But of course, it has to do with the British state in the here and now. You cannot repeat often enough that the profits from slavery made many British institutions, our banks, our universities, our churches, our ruling class with their vast estates, that all has its base in the money from slavery. The Caribbean, Africa, and South America and Asia were all drawn into that system of exploitation. Yet, school children in Britain largely are not told about that truth. They are encouraged to be proud of empire, but really to ask who paid the price for it. So reparations is not just about money, it's about recognizing that the debt, not just the financial debt, but the emotional debt, did not disappear when slavery was abolished. It was simply ignored. So this is where Pan-Africanism becomes so important. The idea that African people, wherever we live, share a connected struggle is so important. Pan-Africanism is about solidarity, about understanding that our liberation is bound together, whether we're in Lagos, Kingston, Accra, or London. The forces that shape our lives, that has produced the economic inequality and the cultural erasure, they all have the same roots. Reparations are part of a wider political project. They're about reclaiming agency in so much that we are directing we are taking forward, we are explaining our lives and our history, refusing to let others write that history for us or to dictate the terms on which justice is defined. We also have to recognise that reparations are not a single event. They are a process. They involved truth-telling, education, and structural change. For instance, it is long past time our education system taught the full history of empire and slavery. Not just the comforting parts, not just the parts which reflect well on the British, oh, you know, we abolished slavery. People need to know, children need to know, that Britain's wealth was not simply the result of our superior understanding or ingenuity or hard work. Britain's economic primacy was also the result of violence and exploitation. We should return, as has been said earlier, the stolen artefacts and cultural property to the countries from which they were taken. That would be a small but meaningful act of respect. We should invest in economic partnerships with Caribbean and African nations. Because, you know, people talk about Africa and Caribbean, and it's almost like they are saying that the reason those countries are poor and the reason those countries need the British and Europeans and Americans to come in and exploit our resources, it's our fault. Maybe if we worked harder, maybe if we were cleverer, maybe if we were as good as them. But in fact, the issues, the economic issues which still challenge Africa and the Caribbean today are the consequence of colonial patterns of exploitation and extraction. And here at home, we need to confront the ongoing inequalities faced by black communities to this day, which have their roots in slavery. Whether it's the fact that our young people are 3 times as likely to be stopped and searched on the street than white people is still the case. I came into politics campaigning on stop and search and the way the British state treats black people. And here we are now. We may have a black Lord Chancellor, and it's great to have a black Lord Chancellor, but on the bench, only 1% of judges are black. If you look at the Metropolitan Police, the proportion of black people in the Met is half the numbers of black people in London as a whole. That's not good enough. But it's like, so we have, you know what I mean, a few black MP, we have a black Lord Chancellor, we have 90 black members of Parliament, and that's fine. But we still, as a society, have not addressed the underlying issues in this country which hold the diaspora back. And that's what we need to do. It's not, you know, it's not about, I mean, you hear a lot, I don't want to disrespect anybody, but you hear a lot about Windrush. Windrush this, Windrush that. Windrush was so lovely, Windrush was so, you know, nice. Let me tell you, that generation that came to this country after the Second World War faced a brutality and a harshness and a challenge which we shouldn't forget. Not all niceness. Not all niceness, and we need to remember that. So, we need, as well as remembering the reality of the past, the immediate past, and today, we need to remember, and it's a thing I always say, that when you hear these people talk about migration, they are talking about people of colour. It's another way of talking about race. So reparations and the conversation around them and the writing around them, and Mr. Ryder will speak to that. We are saying that history, British history, is also our history. We also need to remember that this debate is not new. Many of you have worked on this debate for decades. And my friend and colleague, the late Bernie Grant, was chair of the Africa Reparations movement at a time when reparations wasn't as talked about as it is today. I remember a decade ago holding the first meeting on reparations in Parliament after CARICOM launched their 10-point plan. I mean, we've heard that CARICOM isn't doing as well as it should do, but it felt important at the time that they had launched their 10-point plan. There are civil society groups here who've done extraordinary work. These are not fringe groups or groups, I don't know, trying to enjoy themselves. These are serious, principled campaigns for justice, and they have campaigned for decades and decades and decades and lifetimes. But what has been missing, to be honest, and Jackie Mackenzie touched on this, is political courage. Successive governments have avoided this issue for fear of controversy. But my colleague, Abel Ribera-Addy, and some of us others as Member of Parliament, you'll hear from another colleague in a little while, we believe that we have a duty to engage honestly with the evidence. Reparations are not about guilt. Reparations are about responsibility, and this society taking responsibility, because as I think you've heard, as late as 2015, we were, through the Treasury, repaying slave owners. 2015, still spending money to pay back the loan we took out to repay the slave owners. So if, yes, sorry. So if we can take responsibility for repaying slave owners as late as 2015, we can surely take responsibility for repairing and recognising the brutality and the loss of the descendants of slaves. So when we talk about the politics of reparations, we are talking about how we shift from lip service and symbolism to substance, how we turn a moral argument into policy, how we ensure that Britain's reckoning with its past leads to genuine repair, not just wringing hands and words of regret. Pan-Africanism teaches us that no one will hand us justice out of goodwill. It has to be organised, demanded, and sustained. But I also believe that when we pursue justice for those who were enslaved and colonised, we will build a fairer society for everyone, because truth benefits all of us. If we are serious about equality, we must be serious about history. Reparations are not about division, they are about healing, but healing requires honesty. It is time for Britain to grow up and face up to its past. It is time for all of us collectively to ensure that the descendants of the enslaved are not denied justice for a year, for a decade, for a lifetime longer. Thank you all for coming this morning.
Thank you, Diane. Before we bring up another powerful sister in the struggle, I just wanted to give a tribute to two other women who are playing and have played important roles in the struggle. One is, and they sit at different generations, and one has passed this week, and I wonder if you could just stand up for a minute to remember Baroness Hulse, a tireless fighter for justice and always supported Remembrance Day and the restitution agenda. We'll miss her activism. Thank you. And the second tribute was just to a young activist, an academic who joined us about 2 or 3 years ago and then produced this wonderful document on ancestral remains following her MA at SOAS. So Ibn, do you want to stand up? Thank you. And thank you for the work, and it's important to encourage a new generation to get involved and bring their skills and their activism and their passion for these subject matters, and also their expertise from the academy, and Ibn did a great job for the APPG on that. So I'm going to move the order around a little, Esther, if you don't mind, for you to come last. Yeah. So the point was made by Diane about the government and its limitations, and the difficulty in this in this moment of fighting for reparations against the backdrop of new imperialism. Let's call it what it is. If it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, let's call it what it is. Across the world, France returned some items, ancestral remains to Madagascar, but at the same time, France is getting out its president when there's a rebellion going on, so we know that the control is still there. Every time we ask for reparations, there's no money, but there's always money for more war. Grenada and the Caribbean are asking for reparations, but all the pressure that is on the Caribbean countries at the moment to allow the US to use as a base to attack Venezuela is there. Some of them have said no, others are playing along. So there is a context in which we should also be aware that this conversation we're having about reparations it has these multiple levels. And somebody who has always made those connections, which has been the reasons for his passion against war, has been Jeremy Corbyn, the Right Honourable Jeremy Corbyn, who has been a great ally of ours for the work that we do, and I'm very proud to invite him up to address us.
Yes, Thank you very much, and I feel very honoured to be invited to be here. So thank you for that invitation, and also join with you in commemorating and remembering and extolling the life of Baroness Howells, Ros Howells. She was a pathfinder in lots of ways and was a wonderfully friendly, supportive and empathetic person. And however awful my day had been as leader of the opposition at any time, with attacks always within the Labour Party, never from without, she would always come up on when I was leaving the building, give me a hug and say, "Look, it's all going to be all right." She was like that, wasn't she? She was great, and she was always so supportive of Diane, particularly in the early days when Diane was the first black woman elected to Parliament, and I'm sure we all remember Ros for her work. And I can't forget Bernie Grant, my dear friend Bernie, who was, well, Bernie and I had a sort of life together, basically. We were both met in the Haringey campaign against racism. We both met against Haringey campaign against the cuts. We then were both working together in the National Union of Public Employees. Then we both ended up as members of Parliament together. So Bernie and I sort of went through life together. And I would say to everybody, I loved Bernie dearly, but you didn't really know Bernie until you'd had an argument with him. Once you'd had an argument with him, it was okay, you know. I remember him saying to me that he was determined to raise the issue of injustice, history and reparations in Parliament. And he did. And he did it brilliantly. And he began a debate that, frankly, should have begun in the Labour movement 100 years ago, at least, on the issue of post-Empire Britain and how the Labour movement and the left should react to the history of empire. But that didn't happen. Bernie was the one who was challenging this nationalist version of history that ignored the levels of colonial struggle that had gone on and the levels of poverty that had been left behind at the end of empire. And Bernie began to open up that debate. That debate hadn't really happened to the extent it should have done in the Labour movement before then. And if you go through the annals of the great struggles of workers' movements in pretty well every British colony at various times, occasionally there were great acts of solidarity made by workers in Britain, but not very often. The trade union movement and the Labour Party were essentially often either ignorant or deliberately ignorant of those struggles that were going on. And so I think it's that sort of area that we need to think about very much. I was in Jamaica twice in the past year. Once because I was invited to go to a conference at University of West Indies on issues relating to history and reparations, but also on another visit to go to Kingston College, which I once worked at in the 1960s. And I have to say, I don't think I taught very much, but I certainly learnt a great deal from all the students at Kingston College. And I'm looking forward to welcoming a whole lot of students from Kingston College into Parliament early next month for them to reminisce about their lives and their contribution to our society here. When we were discussing the issues of reparations with Professor Bogues and with Hilary Beckles and so many others at University of the West Indies, I have to say, well done UWI for taking up the cause. Well done them on the research they've done into it. And well done them to giving a strong intellectual bite to the whole principle of reparations. And I say that because when you raise the issue of reparations most times in Britain, people say, oh yeah, it's all that stuff in the British Museum. Maybe they either say it ought to go back or it ought to stay here, but that's sometimes the sum total of the debate. Well, I would advise people to read a very interesting book called Brutish Museums, not British, Brutish Museums. And it goes through in excruciating detail the original location of large numbers of the exhibits that we see in the British Museum. I'm not sure if the author had access to the vast warehouses of unshown items and things that they've got. And so I think a campaign for reparation of artifacts is very important, because it helps to get the principle across that the Benin bronzes and all the other things should never have come here in the first place. And so that is an important thing. But that doesn't cover the whole story, because the whole story is much wider and much deeper than this. I went to South Africa 2 weeks ago, mainly campaigning about Palestine, but not exclusively. And we did a very large number of meetings. We travelled from Pokawame up by the Zimbabwe border all the way to Cape Town, and I went to Namibia as well. And we held a very large number of public meetings, as I say, mainly supporting the South African government's position on going to the International Court of Justice in support of the Palestinian people, because they do need support for that. And the price they're paying for that through the tariffs that President Trump has imposed on South Africa and imposed on Namibia and all the other countries that signed the ICJ application. And I went to Namibia because I was fascinated to go there, and it's not impossible to get there from Cape Town. And I went to the memorial for the Herero and Nana people who were murdered by a genocide by the German colonialists in 1904, I think it was, when the German colonialists decided they would wipe out 100% of the population of those two nations. They succeeded in killing 80% of them, but 20% survived. And there is a wonderful museum tower in the center of Windhoek which commemorates them and explains what happened. But this is generally not known about around the world. Forensic architects have done a lot of work exposing what happened there and the scale of the genocide that went on. But it's also generally thought that the Nazi idea of total extermination of a population came from their experience in what was then German Southwest Africa at that time. And so we should remember those people and give a lot of credit to the government of Namibia for the way in which they've commemorated it and the way in which they've educated their own population about it. And I want to say thank you to all of them. But during all the discussions we had, it's pretty obvious that South Africa, Namibia, and other countries around the world, but let's concentrate on them for the moment, are going to suffer because of the tariffs that have been imposed upon them. And South Africa has massive problems to deal with: the history of apartheid, basically economic apartheid that still continues in South Africa is largely unaddressed. These things have to be dealt with. But if their trade with the USA is now going to be restricted, this is a huge opportunity for a restoration of the whole Africa unity, Africa market, Africa development ideal, which needs to get some legs to it and needs to get it going. Because if you look at the continent of Africa, it now has the slightly faster growing population than the rest of the world, but that is probably reducing in most countries. But it also has, by far and away, the greatest reserves of every single one of the key minerals that every industrial society wants. Every single one of them exists in Africa in very large quantities indeed. And by and large, the lack of unity across Africa means that that power is not asserted. When Niger was having an argument with the French about the French military presence in Niger and decided to withhold all uranium exports, which meant that the French nuclear power industry was in trouble, the French very quickly got to the table to sort something out. They couldn't, in fact, they couldn't get there fast enough because they could see electricity cuts in France coming because of the actions of the government in Niger. That's exactly what the OPEC nations did in the 1970s. And it had a massive effect on the prosperity of those oil-producing nations. So what I think is exciting is there's going to be, I think, a big development in African unity, forced on it largely by the tariffs. But through Progressive International, which I'm a member of, that's an organization of basically radical governments, trade unions, community organizations, and so on. There's a lot of analysis work being done on the real pricing of goods that come out of former colonies. And so if you look at the minerals that come out of any African country, what comes out is the rawest of raw materials. They're only refined as much as it is necessary to reduce the freight costs of taking them somewhere else. You take minerals, you take basic products like cocoa, and so on, all the way through it. You'll find always the development of the finished product is somewhere else. This is a legacy of the whole colonial mentality that Africa as a continent had to be a place for the exporting of basic raw materials to Britain, to France, to Germany, Spain, Italy, Russia, USA, and so on. And all of them are underpriced for the minerals that they export. All of them then have to pay to re-import those goods in finished goods, finished products, even finished food. And I think it's that sort of area that we need to look at in reparations. So yes to the return of artifacts, yes to the payment of cash sums to assist development in particular countries, particularly Caribbean islands. But I think we also need to legally think about this. And I was very interested in Jackie's point about this. Legally think about how whenever trade agreements and trade treaties are made, we factor into the trade treaty a reparations payment through payment for goods, services, products and exports, which will reflect the massive amount of wealth made in Britain, France, Germany, Spain and so on from the underpayment for natural resources over the past 200 to 300 years. It wouldn't all happen straight away, but it would be something that we could propose as what I think would be a very, very important way forward. And that thinking is going on in a lot of places. And the point that Jackie was making is a very good and very important one. We do need to measure ourselves, if you like, on what we're doing and what we achieve in these actually quite numerous meetings and conferences that take place around the world. And despite the best efforts of the British, Canadian, New Zealand and Australian governments, the last Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting did discuss reparations. Interestingly, Britain certainly didn't want to discuss it, but they were forced to in the end. We need to keep forcing the pressure on that. So I'll finish on this because I'm conscious of our time. There's, I think, two important things we have to do. We have to ensure there is more debate and discussion about it, partly around prominent cases that you can get an interest in, such as the Drax family and the amount of money they've made out of slavery. The points that Diane made about the fact that it was until 2015 we were still paying the slave owners. The victims of slavery and the descendants of the victims of slavery have yet to get a penny piece from any European government. So that is a reasonable demand to be making now, which should reflect on the communities in this country and elsewhere. But we also have to, which is what I guess many of us have been doing for many years, challenge the way in which history is taught in our schools and to our children. Because we're probably not always conscious of it in school, but actually attitudes are formed very, very early on in children's minds. And those attitudes come from the teaching of history. I mean, I remember in primary school being given a sort of world map. This big thing was stuck up on the wall there. And the teacher went there with a big stick and started pointing to bits of the world that were coloured pink. And being the sort of inquisitive person I am, I said, why are they coloured pink? She said, because they're ours. Wow. Wow. And then she corrected herself and said, well, they're actually dominions, which wasn't even true anyway. It was, she got it sort of 100% wrong in every conceivable direction. But you think about that. Small children pick up things very, very quickly. Racist attitudes come very, very early on from history teaching and the idea of supremacy of one people over another. We've all seen the way it plays out on the streets much later on. So whilst I absolutely want to see the curriculum at GCSE level and secondary school level changed and improved a great deal, absolutely I do, and I want to see much more teaching of colonial history and the reality of colonial history in secondary schools, I'm not saying that's the only thing to do. What I think is far, far more important is the teaching of fundamental ideas of global infrastructure history and where our knowledge comes from in primary schools from the very earliest years onwards. So we need to be thinking very hard about how we can bring children together on that. Now, I visit a lot of primary schools, mainly in my own area, but not exclusively. Some of them do it absolutely brilliantly, and they really are fantastic, and there's really imaginative teachers trying to do it. Some of them don't do it at all, and it just simply never comes out. So I would have thought the areas we need to be working on are education, information, and campaigning on the principle of reparations. Because once any rational person understands where the amazing levels of wealth of all the European countries came from and the continuing levels of it come from, then they would say, well, actually, you've got a fair, just, and reasonable point there. And so I think those are areas that we have to campaign on and push on very, very hard, because if we don't do that, then it's going to be very hard to win all the legal arguments and legal points that Jackie and others have so brilliantly put here today. And so reparations is an issue whose time has come, whose justice has come. And a final point I'd make is, if you look at the economy of any former colony of Britain in the Caribbean, Africa, most of Asia as well, what you'll find is that, yes, they receive some levels of overseas aid, but that has been disgracefully cut by the current government to, what, a quarter of what it was, or something like that. But they're also underpaid for the resources they produce. What does Congo get for all the cobalt it produces? Absolutely almost nothing. Who makes money out of it? The mobile phone manufacturers all over the world. And you could say that for almost any other mineral. And then look at the levels of indebtedness those countries have been forced into ever since the oil crisis of the 1970s, when the debt got worse. They were then had structural adjustment programs imposed upon them, which meant the privatization of large numbers of industries that had been taken into public ownership on independence. And so you then end up with an economy wholly a plaything of global multinationals and the banks of Western Europe and North America raking in billions in interest payments from countries whose children are having to pay to go to primary school. We need justice, real justice, for the people of the former colonies, and that's a comprehensive thing. Education, agitation, organisation, but above all, economic and social justice as well. So let's go for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bernie. Jeremy, thank you very much. We're running really behind schedule, so I'm going to press the rest of the speakers to take 5 minutes, make the comprehensive points that you want to make within that time. And Jeremy mentioned the British museums. And I just wanted to mention that the author is in the audience, Dan Hicks, so you may want to catch up with him afterwards.
Is the book on sale as well?
I don't know whether the book's on sale, but the author is in the audience, and he will be participating in one of the sessions in the afternoon. So, Marcus, if you can come up and give us... Marcus has worked with Lenny on this new book on reparations.
And my book's on sale, by the way. Hi, everyone. When the book, The Big Payback, The Case for Reparations for Slavery and How They Would Work, came out, it's the book that myself and Lenny Henry wrote. When it came out, I had a look at some of the headlines, and I thought, well, here we go again. According to the Daily Mail, the Telegraph, the Times, the Express, and of course GB News, Lenny Henry had apparently gone out and written a book and personally demanded £18.8 trillion in slavery reparations for himself. The headlines read, shocking, Lenny Henry claims 18 trillion in slavery reparations for black British people. Lenny Henry brutally mocked after 18 trillion reparation demand. I'm not sure who was mocking him at the point when that headline was written, but they'd clearly decided that he was being mocked. Now, I have to say, if I or Lenny were personally demanding 18.8 trillion, I'd be on a private island somewhere called Reparations Isle, sipping coconut water and watching The Real McCoy on repeat. Who said they'd be with me? All right, cool. All right. You and me together. But seriously, obviously, that's not what the book says, and that's not what we said. What the headlines should have said is Lenny Henry quotes the most respected and comprehensive review into reparations ever conducted. That, of course, is the Brattle Report published in 2023, an economic study commissioned to calculate the scale of the financial debt owed from slavery. It found that Britain's historical slavery debt could amount to around 18.8 trillion. And when that report came out, the headlines looked very different. BBC Online, UK's 18 trillion slavery debt is an underestimation, UN judge says. The Guardian, UK cannot ignore calls for slavery reparations, says leading UN judge. Those were serious, sober, well-informed discussions. But the papers that gave the impression from the headlines that that Lenny had just plucked out the 18.8 trillion out of the air, those same outlets either ignored the Brattle Report entirely when it was published or buried it deep online where no one would find it. Because let's be honest, who reads past the headlines? And I would stress, if you actually read the Telegraph, there's a piece in the Telegraph today, the piece is actually okay. This is what's so weird. The piece in the Daily Mail, if you actually read it all the way through, it's all right. The headlines are completely crazy, right? Because let's be honest, it's really shocking. It's really shocking that it's, I don't know why it's okay, right? I know. I'm not encouraging you to read it, I'm just saying, right? Because let's be honest, who reads past the headlines these days? Not in the age of X, Instagram, and TikTok soundbites. And yes, some mentioned the Brattle Report, but it was way down. All right? And why? Because it's easier that way. It's easier to frame reparations as just a number, a scary, impossible number. It's easier to pitch white people against black people, to turn a conversation about justice into one about resentment. It's easier to quote Lenny Henry than to actually engage with the massive body of academic and moral work that has been done on this issue. But we shouldn't be surprised. This is how calls for justice are often received, and reparations at its heart is a call for justice. When myself and Lenny were interviewed by The Guardian, their headline was very different. It read, "It goes beyond getting a cash refund for slavery, Lenny Henry and Marcus Ryder on the case for reparations." And that's the real story. Because what we're talking about isn't just money, it's repair, moral, social, educational, cultural, you name it. We're repairing the damage that has been done by the transatlantic slavery. Right? Now, the UK's approach to reparations shouldn't surprise anyway. They simply don't want to talk about it. When the Commonwealth leaders tried to raise reparations last year, Keir Starmer, the man who is meant to be leading this country, actively tried to stop the discussion. He tried, he failed. They did discuss reparations at the Commonwealth Leaders Summit anyway, because the rest of the world is talking about reparations, and it's Britain that's become the global outlier. If you recognise and respect African countries, Caribbean countries, Asian countries, South American countries, what we now call the global majority, then you have to recognise that this conversation is already happening. We've simply had the audacity to respect and amplify the views of those nations, the CARICOM nations of the Caribbean and the African Union representing 55 African countries. The book has got just details the detailed and thoughtful and moral case for reparations. And here's the thing. The very first point in CARICOM's 10-point plan for reparations isn't about money at all. It's about a formal apology, a recognition of the heinous crimes that have been committed, a recognition that what happened was wrong and its legacy is still with us today. When people rush to talk about the money, It's a way of avoiding the truth. Because if you focus on the number, you don't focus on the pain. And it's history repeating itself. When abolitionists for slavery were calling for the abolition of slavery, they jumped straight to the money. The people who were opposing it, rather, jumped straight to the money, saying, well, it will wreck the economy. Right? They didn't engage in the moral argument. They knew how to derail the argument by jumping straight to the money. The money's important. Don't get me wrong. I'm not satisfied with just an apology. We need the money. But the way of derailing the argument is to ignore the other 9 points of CARICOM's plan and just jump to the money. And that's what we see with the headlines. But reparations are coming. Keir Starmer tried to stop them. The Daily Mail, the Express, British media are trying to mock serious academic work about them. We've seen what happens when Britain tries to ignore the issues on the world stage. It looks like King Canute trying to hold back the tide, because the tide is coming in. The issue is being discussed. Real academic work is being done. And if Britain wants to tackle racism seriously, if Britain wants to be credible to black people domestically and globally, then we need a sensible, informed, moral conversation about reparations. Not a debate framed as Lenny Henry wants all your money, but a debate which is framed about the absolute injustice and the heinous crimes that have been committed against us. Because the truth is, we don't need your money. If we are Pan-Africanist, we can work it out, right? What we want is Britain's honesty. What we want is the recognition of what has been happened to us and a shared commitment to repair what history has broken. Thank you.
Marcus, we do need the money as an issue of justice. Scott, do you want to come? Again, because of the time, please be as tight as you can.
Sure. I also need to go to the loo, so I'll keep it really quickly. I would add one more thing to our list of requests, and that is, it doesn't cost a penny to stop the abuse. That's what reparations is. It's from the Latin, as Sister Esther taught me. It's from the Latin, to repair. Let's stop the abuse, the ongoing abuse that continues, whether it's in our local communities, with people of colour being excluded from organising community events, from the disproportionate, someone mentioned earlier on, of arrests made to our black and brown brothers and sisters. I'm Councillor Scott Ainslie. I'm the leader of the Green Group on Lambeth Council. I'd like to start by thanking, thank you. I'd like to start by thanking with the libation, because I feel as though it's such an important thing to summon up all the voices of the past that have led in this struggle, and to remember the over 15 million souls that were trafficked, humanly trafficked across the oceans to be used as slaves. So I personally feel and hear the ancestors summoned up into this room every time I get up. We're all from the same African mother, after all, are we not? I think it's really important that we remember to connect with the stories of our past. And my personal story on this journey is when I've been a Lambeth councillor for 11 years, and in 2019 I was elected to the European Parliament. And as the London Green Party member of the European Parliament, I went on a reparations march because someone handed me a leaflet, and one of the black members of the Green Party said, "You should go." So I went, and there weren't that many white faces in there, and I got speaking to this gentleman, and we walked 6 miles from Brixton to the centre of London. That was Kofi Mawuli-Klue. And I said, "I think the Green Party have got a policy on reparations. Would you mind looking at it?" He read it, and he said, "Scott, this is quite good, but the problem with it talks about state-led solutions." Now, the problem with state-led solutions is, someone like Cameron will go to Jamaica and say, "I'll give you £10 million to build a new prison." There the abuse continues, right? So I said, Luke, will you work with me and we'll reform the text? And what Esther, Kofi, and some of my colleagues came up with was a text that was cross-party, by the way. And I must honor Sonia Winifred, who is a leading member of the Windrush generation. She was a councillor who was in the Labour Party, but she left because she was treated really badly for supporting the humanitarian motion on Gaza. And she was cross-examined in a way that no human being should be. So she left, and now she's joined the Green Party, I'm happy to announce. And I know why I'm here. Sometimes I wonder, how can I possibly justify inviting me here? And it's to be a constant provocation to the Labour Party and the Labour movement. And it's to get them to do the right thing, because when we passed the cross-party motion in Lambeth, the landmark motion, back on the 15th of July 2020, please read the text, because it honours everyone that led to this stage where we got to. Labour don't like it. They've started limiting the amount of words you can put into a motion. It's absolutely despicable. So we passed the first ever landmark motion in July 2020, and I invite you to read the text to get the United Kingdom government to atone and begin a reparative justice process for the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans. That was passed there because it's home to the largest African diasporan population in the United Kingdom. And of course, we have Windrush Square in the centre of Brixton. And then we passed similar. So the idea was, and it came out of some thinking and chatting, was that if national government fails to show leadership, let local government lead the way. And the whole idea was that also state-led solutions, yes, they're important and they're up against it, but you can begin to heal in your own communities. And there should be nothing about us without us. I see so many times in my surgery people with black and brown faces that have poor housing, that are living in poverty, that are struggling to keep food on the table. And this is why we came up with, there is no environmental justice. There is no social justice. There is no economic justice without racial justice, because it affects black and brown people living in this country, and we see it with ongoing racism. So look, I had lots more to say, but I'm conscious I want to give the floor to other people. I just want to say the Green Party have led on this. So going from Lambeth, we passed a motion in Islington Council, the London Assembly. The big coup was passing a motion, and I have to thank Cleo Lake, the former mayor of Bristol, for helping to pass the motion in Bristol. We've got to do this in Liverpool, in Manchester, in Edinburgh, in Glasgow, in every single council that benefited and has remembered enslavers rather than the enslaved. That balance has to be redressed at a local level, and people must have places to meet. The Green Party of England and Wales, months later, were the first political party in the United Kingdom to pass a motion to get the UK government to atone and begin a reparative justice process. Now, since then, the Green Party of England and Wales has created a global majority, Greens, and they have brought forward, and we unanimously passed the motion to get for the Green Party to be the first party to have, at its roots and in its structure, an anti-racism policy, so that every single platform that's operation within the framework puts anti-racism at the heart of a party structure. And that is led by a racism policy working group. Look, there's a lot more that I'd like to say. I think that one thing I'd like to finish on, and it's this, is that, and people have touched on it earlier, as I go on and I think about this, and I'm reading a book at the moment called The Finance Curse, which talks about how the sort of Western extractivism, the white European model is broken us away from our sense of humanity. We've disassociated ourselves in a way that we're handing profits, the way things are run, the way things are governed, to a bunch of psychopaths. They really are. And that's why I think, and I spoke to someone in the speaker's room earlier on who was talking about the impact on us all of this white ecocentricism, which must be addressed, because that extractivism is stopping us from working within planetary boundaries. That is extracting wealth where the top 20 families in this country own more than 50% of the rest of the 50% of us. So this is an issue that we have to address. And look, we're up against it, okay? We're up against the oligarchy that now control on the online world and algorithms and all that kind of stuff. But let's begin to heal locally. Let's begin to heal nationally. Let state-led solutions be led from the grassroots up, not from the top down. And I want to finish with a question that's a provocation. So if countries can't admit that they're wrong and they wish to atone and begin a reparative justice process, what's happened to the offers from companies like Green King, Guinness, all the banks, all the universities, all of these people who have said, we admit that the Quakers, that we have done wrong, we've benefited in the past. What's happening with them? I want to hear that in this room today. I want to hear what's happened to the tokenistic sums that they've handed out. They scooped away with a big claw hammer, a big, one of those things that extracts a lot of stuff. But what they're offering back is a tiny little baby fist in compensation. So I want to hear what's happened to those guys and what's happened to those companies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. And that extractive model, it never went away, but it's in hyper mode at the moment. And we don't want to come back here in another 30 years and our children come back here talking about the damage that is being done now and asking for reparations for the damage that will be unleashed in the next few years. So the fight that we are involved in here is not just for historic injustice, it's for ongoing injustice, and we have to keep that in mind. So Esther is going to end this session. We're very late with the breakout sessions where we will further deepen the discussions in specific sectors. So immediately she finishes, please find the breakout sessions that you've signed up to. And can I also ask the technical people to inform those participants for the breakout sessions who are waiting online, so that because of the delay. But I want you to give a big hand to one of the stalwart fighters for reparations in the UK, Sister Esther. Thank you.
Warm greetings. Warm greetings. To Belle, thank you so much. To fellow Secretariat members, and of course to Diane as Chair of the APPG for African Reparations, and our two panels and all our distinguished guests. I'm Esther from the Stop the Maangamizi campaign and Executive Director of the Maangamizi Educational Trust. I want to begin with some words from history. History of reparations organising in this country, not going back too far, but just quoting from the Birmingham Declaration, that was the declaration that came out of the founding of the African Reparations movement that was co-initiated by the late Bernie Grant MP. And in the Birmingham Declaration, which was signed the 1st of January 1994, it states, accepting our responsibility and obligation to our ancestors for ensuring that the African identity is proclaimed, maintained, and developed, and that Africa is restored to its rightful place at the center of world politics. Calls upon all people of African origin, hear this, in the Caribbean, Africa, Europe, the Americas, and elsewhere to support the movement for reparations and join forces with a view to forming a strong, united front capable of exposing, confronting, and overcoming the psychological, economic, and cultural harm inflicted upon us by peoples of European origin. So I draw us back in terms of this panel being about the politics of reparations and Pan-Africanism to remind us about the Pan-Africanism that has informed the shaping of reparations thought, discourse, and actions in Britain, going back to the mid-1700s. That is the history of this movement. And we recognize the Sons of Africa and people like Oluda Equiano, but particularly Otobo Kugwano, who first called for a commission of inquiry that we in the Stop the Maangamizi, We Charge Genocide Ecocide campaign are honoring today as a campaign demand. In April of this year, we had a conference that was organized by the government of Togo in preparation for the 9th Pan-African Congress taking place in December. And Professor Robert Xosei, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Cooperation and African Integration, said, "African people must speak with one voice. There are no African peoples. There is only one African people, wherever they live and whatever their nationality. Our African identity must be the foundation of our relationship and the driving force behind our unwavering determination." So the core objectives of Pan-Africanism have always been the attainment and securing of holistic reparatory justice. And that Pan-African liberation and nation-building goals have been central to reparations movements in the UK, but globally. The defining features of this include the taking back of Africa that is being recolonized right now, restoring and building it into an unconquerable union of peoples and communities, which is collectively governed by African people at home and abroad. So this is the foundation of reparations. So as we gather today, we gather at a moment of profound opportunity and profound danger. The opportunity is that reparations movements, including what some of us refer to as the International Social Movement for African Reparations, as well as wider movements that we refer to as the People's Reparations International Movement, has achieved visibility unimaginable even a decade ago. We now see new players entering this space: academics, institutions, governments, corporations, faith organizations. We see a breadth of representation here today that also reflects the growing recognition that reparations is not a fringe demand, but a fundamental requirement of justice. Now, the danger. This visibility also increases the danger and the likelihood of co-optation. Reparations gets redefined by those who are not part of building reparations movements. We then have a proliferation and an increased risk of movement capture, elite capture, and state capture, which transform our radical demands for transformative justice into manageable reforms and policies that leave power structures intact. So we have to understand these three forms of capture and how they are taking place today. Just 11 days ago, on the 7th of October, I believe so, yeah, the Namibian government appeared in court in Namibia to defend Germany's refusal to face justice for the genocide against Over-Herero and Nama communities. The Swatboy case, filed by Over-Herero and Nama communities, challenged their exclusion from genocide reparations negotiations. And this in itself demonstrates some of the dangers when we just leave the dialogue to states. And there isn't a recognition about the role and the rights of affected communities to participate in shaping what reparations outcomes and goals they wish to see. And that is why, on the petition that you have on your programs, please look at it, it does also call for and reaffirm that historic demand now for a few centuries for that all-party parliamentary commission of inquiry for truth and reparatory justice. Which we have to acknowledge the role of the Green Party and people like Scott Ainslie, Councillor Scott Ainslie, for listening to us and hearing us when other political parties would not. And of course, Labour came along after. So where do we go from here? It's important that as we are having our deliberations today, whilst we're recognising new faces and voices into this space, that we must remember that we have a duty to be accountable to the affected communities and their leaderships that have been defining, sacrificing, and in many cases have actually been assassinated for this cause. And we have seen that happen. And this cause, yes, we mentioned the late Bernie Grant MP in terms of elected officials, but let us also acknowledge the late Chief Abiola, who was involved with the Organization of African Union and helped organize the famous Reparations Conference in 1993, the Abuja Conference. And let's remember what happened to him as a result of taking up this cause. And you may not know, but he also helped to sponsor the office of Bernie Grant MP and his reparations work, because this work is not funded by Parliament. So we have paid a huge price to be here, and that is why we must ensure that we don't allow this movement capture, elite capture, and state capture to happen on our watch. So whilst we are deliberating, let us acknowledge these movements, what they have been seeking. Let's not just co-opt the language, but let us have the courage to hear the voices. And that is why we have been calling for this commission, because so many people are doing reparations work, but there's no accountability. People get up, and because they get access to resources that movements have never had, they are able to shape and set agendas about us, without us. And what we are saying as peoples, and all of those who have signed the Stop the Maangamizi petition, which was one of the original ones, that calls for this Commission of Inquiry for Truth and Reparatory Justice, is that we want one process in this country where everyone's work can come and be brought into that process, so that we can have a process of national dialogue and reckoning. But this is not a UK process. Because of the British Empire, it must be a global process. Because we here, who are citizens in this country, and those who are not, have come from all over the world. And it's those voices that we are saying must inform the Commission of Inquiry for Truth and Reparatory Justice. It is not like any other commission. We want to hear from all of you reparations activists, your organizations, your proposals, your solutions, so that when we can work out what are the remedies, what is effective redress and repair for our people. recognizing that we have to ensure that as a result of this process, that not only are we transformed, but we transform the global order, and we see that Africa, and we are global Africa, that we are restored to our rightful place as mothers and fathers of humanity. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Can we have a big hand for all the panelists, please?